The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed across the courtroom as tension filled the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. All eyes were glued to the man standing confidently at the front of the room. His uniform, crisp and pristine, reflected his years of service on the force. Officer Brian Harris had been here before, too many times to count, in fact, and he carried himself with the assuredness of someone who knew his word was as good as gold. His testimony rarely faltered, and his delivery had a precision that almost guaranteed conviction. People trusted him, and truth be told, Brian trusted himself. For weeks, he had been preparing for this case. He'd pored over his notes, reviewed every detail of the traffic stop in question, and rehearsed his responses for the inevitable cross-examination. He felt ready, untouchable even. From the moment he climbed into the witness stand, he was certain of the outcome. Everything pointed to an open and shut case, and yet the faintest flicker of tension gnawed at the back of his mind. No case was flawless, and he'd learned the hard way not to underestimate anyone, no matter how outmatched they seemed. But this case? This one felt personal, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the woman sitting quietly at the defense table, unassuming in her black blazer, her hands resting lightly in front of her as though she had all the time in the world. Brian had written her off initially, another defendant who was probably hoping for a lenient ruling. But there was something about the way she sat, calm, collected, not a hint of fear. Most people facing his testimony showed cracks in their confidence long before the trial began, but not her. She didn't fidget, she didn't waver. She hadn't even glanced his way since the proceedings began. She was focused, laser-focused, a detail that Brian found curious. The judge's gravelly voice cut through the silence of the room. "Officer Harris, you may proceed." Clearing his throat, Brian shifted in his seat and launched into his testimony. He recounted the events of the stop, every word sharp and deliberate. The courtroom was silent save for the occasional scratch of a pen against paper or the faint rustling of legal documents. He painted a picture of the encounter that left little room for doubt. A routine stop, a clear violation, and a defendant who was entirely uncooperative. His account tied together seamlessly, just as he knew it would. And when he finished, Brian leaned back slightly, allowing himself the smallest measure of satisfaction. The prosecutor wasted no time in bolstering his statement, asking all the right questions to reinforce the narrative. Brian answered confidently, his words carrying the surety of someone who expected no contradictions. With every sentence, he chipped away at the defense's chances until they were paper thin, or so he thought. When the defense attorney finally stood, Brian prepared himself for the usual round of predictable questions. If there was anything he disliked about trials, it was cross-examinations. They were tedious at best and irritating at worst, but in this case he'd prepared extensively, leaving almost no room for loopholes. He was ready for anything they could throw his way, anything, that is, except for her. The woman at the defense table stood and straightened her blazer in one fluid movement. It took Brian a second to realize that she wasn't just the defendant. She was representing herself in court. That was rare enough to give him pause. Self-representation often signaled desperation more than competence, and yet, as she approached the podium, she held herself with the kind of quiet authority that could silence a room. It made Brian's stomach tighten in a way he couldn't explain. He hadn't anticipated this. She began softly, her voice steady but measured, as though she were laying down the careful foundation of her case. She asked Brian precise questions, many of which he answered with the kind of ease that comes from careful preparation. At first, her approach seemed simple, almost too simple. She wasn't riled up or overly aggressive, a tactic many defendants resorted to in order to discredit an officer's claims. No, she was patient, methodical, and dangerously calm. Then, like a hunter stalking prey, she started to zero in. Each question built on the last with chilling precision, her words cutting through Brian's confidence piece by piece. The courtroom transformed into a chessboard, her moves calculated and deliberate. She asked about details he hadn't thought to focus on, timelines that hadn't seemed relevant, and procedures that hadn't crossed his mind since the stop. It was like she was peeling back the layers of his testimony one at a time, and each layer exposed tiny cracks he hadn't even realized were there. Brian tried to keep up, but her approach was unlike anything he'd encountered before. She wasn't asking these questions randomly. She was setting up something larger, something he couldn't quite see yet. By the time she circled back to her original point, the faint flicker of doubt he'd felt earlier was now a full blaze. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as she paused, her final question hanging in the air. Then, cool and composed, she dropped the first hint of what was coming. "Officer Harris," she said, her voice clear and deliberate. "Are you familiar with my work with a national organization?" Her words sent an immediate ripple through the gallery, attorneys leaning forward in their seats, the stenographer's fingers frozen above her keyboard. Even the judge tilted his head slightly, visibly intrigued. Brian blinked, caught off guard. By the pivot, he hadn't expected her to pull rank or pull something else entirely. The moment demanded his response, but for the first time in years, he didn't have an answer. It wasn't the question itself that rattled him. It was the way she asked it, the confidence in her tone that suggested the answer had already been decided. The room seemed to thrum with a collective, unspoken question. Who was this woman? What national organization was she talking about? Even Brian, composed as he usually was, felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. He forced himself to meet her gaze, but unlike most defendants, she didn't flinch. She stared back, steady and unreadable, as though she were looking at him from the other side of a one-way mirror. Brian scrambled internally, trying to pull every shred of knowledge he had about the case to the surface. He'd reviewed her background. Of course, it was standard procedure. Her name was Maya Turner. She was in her early 40s with no prior criminal record and a seemingly unremarkable life on paper. She worked as a consultant, lived in a modest home, and had no connections to anything that would have raised red flags. Certainly nothing that screamed powerful organization. Or had he missed something? The idea irritated him. No, it terrified him. Because one thing Brian prided himself on was preparation. He wasn't someone who came into a courtroom unarmed with facts. And yet, as she stood there, cool and unshaken, he couldn't stop asking himself if he'd overlooked something important. Maya returned to her table without another word, leaving the question hanging like a heavy fog. Her defense attorney picked up where she left off, pivoting to a series of questions meant to steer the case back into familiar legal territory. But the damage was already done. The courtroom buzzed with quiet whispers, as onlookers tried to unravel the significance of her words. Even the prosecutor glanced at his client with a flicker of unease, and Brian could see the unspoken question in his eyes, too. Who was she? Brian replayed the events of the traffic stop in his mind, searching for answers. It had seemed straightforward then, a routine pullover for a broken taillight. Her demeanor had been frustrating, yes, but not extraordinary. She hadn't yelled or caused a scene. She hadn't resisted. She had been firm, polite even, though there was an edge to her calm that he hadn't appreciated at the time. When he asked for her license and registration, she'd handed them over without issue, but something about the way she looked at him made him feel as though the power dynamic wasn't what it should have been. He hadn't been able to put his finger on it then, and now the memory twisted in his mind like a loose thread, begging to be pulled. He remembered running her plates and coming up empty. No warrants, no unpaid tickets, not even a parking violation. He'd cited her for the taillight, and when she'd signed the ticket, she'd thanked him, her voice as steady as it was now. There had been nothing remarkable about her at the time, or so he'd thought. But in hindsight, there was something unusual about the way she'd driven off without so much as a glance in his direction. Most people stuck to the script. Anger, frustration, maybe even an apology. She'd given him none of those. Instead, she'd left him standing on the side of the road, feeling oddly insignificant for reasons he couldn't quite explain. Now her calm resolve seemed to have taken on an entirely new dimension. He found himself wondering about the life she lived outside the courtroom. What did she do when she wasn't sitting at that defense table or studying law books to represent herself? For the first time, he regretted not digging deeper into her background. The remark about the national organization had thrown him off so completely that he knew there had to be more to her story than she'd allowed anyone to see. Meanwhile, Maya watched the courtroom with an expression that could only be described as amused curiosity. If she was nervous, she hid it well, and from the looks of it, she seemed to enjoy the ripple effect her comment had caused. Her defense attorney leaned toward her and whispered something, to which she nodded with the faintest of smiles. It was the kind of smile that made Brian's stomach tighten. This wasn't the look of someone who felt the odds stacked against her. It was the look of someone who knew something no one else did. The prosecutor tried to regain control of the narrative, redirecting attention to the evidence against her. Photos, statements, his own testimony. But Brian felt it in his bones. The energy in the room had shifted. It wasn't about the evidence anymore. It was about her. Whatever she was holding back had created a vacuum in the courtroom, and no amount of legal strategy could fill it. As the day wore on, the tension only grew. The judge called for a brief recess, and people filed out of the room in hushed conversation, their words blending into an indistinct murmur. Brian stayed seated, his eyes fixed on Maya as she flipped through a neat stack of papers. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge him, but he could feel her presence like a pressure waiting to be released. It wasn't just unsettling, it was maddening. "Something on your mind, officer?" The voice startled Brian, and he turned to see the prosecutor pulling out the chair beside him. "No," he lied, clearing his throat. "Just thinking." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "She got under your skin, huh?" "What?" Brian shook his head. "No, of course not. It's just—" He hesitated, unsure how to put his thoughts into words. How could he explain the unsettling sense that Maya Turner was far more than she appeared to be? "She's bluffing," the prosecutor said with shrug. "It's a tactic. Make some vague, dramatic claim to sow doubt. Stick to the facts and we've got this in the bag." Brian wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that Maya's composure was just a clever act. But the more he thought about it, the more he doubted it. She wasn't bluffing. That much he was certain of. Whatever she'd hinted at earlier was real, and it was only a matter of time before she revealed it. His only question was when, by. The time the recess ended, Brian felt like a taut wire stretched to its breaking point. He thought about calling some contacts, seeing if they could dig up more information on Maya before the next session. But something stopped him. Maybe it was pride, or maybe something deeper. A part of him that didn't want to admit he was in over his head. The judge returned and the trial resumed. Maya didn't speak for the rest of the day, leaving her attorney to address the remaining points of evidence. But her silence spoke louder than any argument could have. With every passing moment, she seemed more composed, more deliberate, and more dangerous. When the session adjourned for the day, Brian found himself avoiding her gaze as he stood to leave. But of course, she didn't avoid his. For the briefest moment, her eyes locked onto his, a hint of a challenge flickering within them. It wasn't aggressive or unkind. It was a quiet, unyielding promise. And in that moment, Brian knew this case was far from over. Toole